That picture should look sort of familiar to you. We were there not that long ago, and I would like to be in Charleston at a salt marsh right this minute. I don't know about y'all. Okay, let's talk about estuaries a little bit. I sent you this so that you could use it to take notes on. So I'll just kind of go in order so that your notes will be sort of organized in this way. So we've talked about estuaries a little bit throughout the year, but just focusing on them as a particular ecosystem. So what do we mean by an estuary? Well, the top of your page says estuaries are where the rivers meet the sea. In other words, it is a somewhat enclosed area where fresh water and salt water meet. Now, obviously, those two are going to mix, but if you remember from back earlier in the year when we investigated, saltwater and freshwater have different characteristics. That mixing may or may not completely equal out the salinity. So what are some things we can say about estuaries just in general? They're very productive ecosystems, and we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. They are fairly diverse ecosystems in terms of the organisms that live there, and yet somewhat specialized, because not every organism can tolerate the variations that you have to be able to withstand in an estuary. It's a tough place to live in some ways. They're very rich in nutrients. So the inflow of fresh water, the dissolved materials that come with that bring a richness of nutrients. So there's a bounty of life that lives in the ecosystems. So we've got 4 types of ecosystems if we think about them in terms of how they're formed. So the first type, and this salt marsh is an example here, is the bar-built estuary. And that means that you've got barrier islands or sandbars that create sort of an inlet area. So Charleston, the North Carolina Outer Banks would be examples of this type of estuary. They tend to be shallow compared to the other types. They have a limited amount of tidal action. So in other words, the tidal range from high to low, there is one, obviously, but it's not as great as in some other types of estuaries. Because of that, because the tides aren't as strong as in some other areas, the mixing in a bar-built estuary tends to be largely because of winds and then the currents that they cause, not so much from huge tidal flow. All right, a second type, and we'll see that this coastline actually will show the first and the second types. So here we are, these are the North Carolina Outer Banks. And so you can see that these barrier islands create little shallow inlet areas that we would consider estuaries. Now, the second type that is sometimes called a drowned river valley or a coastal valley, I think is the other name for it. And the Chesapeake Bay is going to be an example of that. So there's a picture of Chesapeake Bay, which is quite large. So a drowned river valley type of estuary, the ocean moves into a river valley that already exists because sea levels rise. This is actually the most common type of estuary there is. In the last 15 to 20,000 years or so, sea levels have been rising. They have risen 120 something meters over that time period. And so that means that oceans will move into river valleys, move up the mouth of the river. And so it creates this special type of estuary. Another example, this would be on the English coast where the mouth of the River Thames comes in. All right, a third type of estuary is called a tectonic estuary, and it's caused because of some tectonic activity. So the crust moves and then some ground subsides, and so it creates a depression, and then the ocean moves in and fills in that depression. So San Francisco Bay is an example of an estuary that was created because of geologic activity like that. And then the fourth type is an odd word. It's Fjord, but it's pronounced fjord. This is a fjord in Alaska. Fjords are created by the movement of glaciers through an area. So the glaciers tend to produce very steep U-shaped valleys as they move through. And so then the ocean will move into those valleys as the glaciers subside. They tend to be very deep. So where the bar-built estuary is very shallow, the fjords tend to be very deep. And because of that, you don't have as much mixing vertically, so you'll have a greater separation of fresh water on top and salt water on the bottom. So obviously the Alaskan coast, the Canadian coast, Norway has fjords. It's a Norwegian word. So that's not a type of landscape that I've ever gotten to see, but I would like to. It's quite pretty. All right, so we'll come back to this in just a moment, these estuarine communities. That'll be letter E. But before that, I want to talk about some of the variations that all estuaries experience. So first would be, obviously, there's going to be variation in salinity. If you're mixing fresh water, which could have, if it's pure water, it has 0 salinity, with typical ocean water, which maybe you remember from way back we talked about, it's about 3.5% average salinity. So in an estuary, then you're going to have somewhere, a mixture of that. It's probably not going to be a perfect average at 1.5. The typical average salinity of an estuary is about 1.7%, but that's a lot lower than the oceans. So if you're an organism that lives in these waters, that's going to be a challenge. How does the salinity differ in an estuary? So in terms of variations in salinity, the variations are due to, number one, location. So if you think about it, let me go back 1 or 2 or 3. If you think about it, the highest salinity is going to be in the area nearest where the ocean is flowing in. And the lowest salinity will be in the area where the river is flowing down to the waters. So there's more fresh water here and more salt water here. So your salinity varies in that it increases as you move out to sea or decreases as you go upstream, either way you want to think about it. All right, another variation is that the salinity will vary by depth. As you remember, salt water is more dense, so it's going to sink to the bottom. So the densest water is at the bottom, and the least dense water is on top. So you'll have less salinity and then increasing salinity as you get deeper. And then a third way that the salinity is going to vary, it depends on the seasons. Where are you in terms of rainfall? Certain seasons may experience greater rainfall. So if you add fresh water in that way, that decreases the salinity. Or if you're in the really hot part of the summer where evaporation increases, remember that actually increases salinity because the water leaves but the salt's left behind. So salinity varies by location, by depth, and by seasons. All right. Estuaries will also experience differences in the flow of the water. It depends on the shape and the slope of the floor of the estuary. So you may have very gradual slope, and the tidal flow will be kind of gentle. Or in some areas, the tidal flow is a tremendous and strong, and you may have a tidal range that's very large. The variations in water flow can be estuary shape, winds. It can also be due to the seasons, rainfall, snow melt. So you have excessive amounts of water flowing in at certain times of the year. As I said, tides. And then A fifth reason that affects the water flow in estuaries, it's kind of interesting, is the Coriolis effect actually has an effect on flow into estuaries. So in the northern hemisphere, the Coriolis effect causes the fresh water to be deflected to the right as it moves into or towards the ocean. All right, a third variation that estuary life has to deal with is in substrate, meaning bottom material. So if you think about it, if a lot of sediment's being carried by the rivers as they come in, the stronger flow of water is up here at the top, at the mouth of the river. So that water may be strong enough to carry heavier particles like sand. But then as it moves through, the water loses some of its power. And so the heavier particles get deposited in the upper estuary, and the finer, smaller particles can be carried a little further, and so mud ends up down here. So in an estuary, you may have a more sandy bottom in the upper part and a mud bottom in the lower part. Now, why does that matter? Well, it makes a difference in how easy it is for organisms to burrow down in, and it makes a difference in terms of the amount of oxygen. Because if you have mud, so down here in the lower estuary, mud will carry a lot of nutrients along with it because it's going to carry a lot of detritus. But that means you'll have a lot of bacteria, so they'll use up a lot of oxygen. Also, the water doesn't flow as easily through mud as it does through sand, and the water is the way the oxygen is going to get replenished. So it tends to be that the muddy part down here has a lower oxygen content than the upper estuary. And then lastly, there's variation in the amount of sunlight. So if you think about how much sediment's being carried in this water, if the water's murky, that blocks some of the sunlight. And so if the water is less clear, then it may be more difficult for your phytoplankton or grasses that live on the floor of the estuary to get enough sunlight. So my point is that life in the estuary requires flexibility. You have to be able to adapt to a lot of change. So on letter D, adapting to life in an estuary, you have to be able to deal with extremes of the characteristics that we just talked about in part C. All right, so first let's think about animals. Most of the animals that live in estuaries have the ability to adapt to a wide range of salinities. In other words, they have the ability to somehow deal with the changes that are going to occur either throughout the day with the tides or with seasonal changes. So how do animals adapt? Well, some of them may burrow, like down into the mud or in the sand. Some of them may, if they have a shell, they may close that shell up so that if, low tide, they're going to sit and wait it out. That's especially, of course, common for something that's sessile, living attached. Or animals may move up or down the estuary depending on what's happening with the flow of water and the salinity, if they have that ability. All right, so animals can adapt by burrowing, closing shells, and moving up or down the estuary. Well, how about plants? They obviously don't have those as options. So plants that can live here, that can tolerate salt water, will either absorb extra solutes so that they become, that their tonicity is equal. So they're not hypertonic or hypotonic to the waters. So they may absorb extra solutes. So some of the grasses that live in estuaries will do that. Or some of them have an even more specialized ability in that they can excrete salts. So do you remember talking about Spartina, which was the very common grass that we saw here? That's it. the women that were making the seagrass baskets that we saw in Charleston, some of that was Spartina grass. That grass has the ability to excrete salt from its leaves. And so the excess salt water is not a problem for those plants. So plants will either absorb solutes to match their environment or excrete the excess salts. So all in all, estuaries are going to be very productive areas. They have lots of nutrients. One way they have a lot of nutrients is because all the detritus, all the plant material that decays provides a lot of nutrients. There are lots of bacteria that are important producers in estuaries, and there's so many plants that live in estuaries. They're a plant-dominated type of ecosystem. So estuaries are very highly productive. Nutrients, detritus, bacteria decomposing, and the abundance of plants make it a very highly productive ecosystem. So next I want to focus on the types of communities that we'll see in ecosystems. First up, just what we would typically call an open water, or just like the bay. What kinds of organisms are we going to see there? All right. Well, within the bay, the open water, out in the middle of the bay, you may see things like, that's eelgrass as a common producer, or you're going to have a lot of phytoplankton in the bay itself. So those are the main producers, eelgrass and phytoplankton. You're going to see in the bay lots of juvenile fish. Do you remember talking about that when we were in Charleston? That estuaries are very important nursery grounds for juvenile fish. A lot of the commercially caught fish, if you were to go out on a charter, or if you were to watch the boats coming in and out that are catching fish with big nets that they trawl behind them, a lot of those fish start life as juveniles in these nursery grounds in the estuary. They're also going to be important for migrating fish. A lot of fish that maybe move along the coast during the seasons will spend some time in estuaries. All right, next up, let's think about mud flats. Now, they don't look like particularly important or productive areas, but they actually are. Mud flats are really common in areas that have gently sloping bottoms and a pretty good sized tidal range, difference between high tide and low tide. Now, there are a lot of challenges to living here. One of those is obviously this area would have been covered with water at high tide, but at low tide it's not. So for some organisms, desiccation, remember drying out, that can be a significant problem. There also will be then huge temperature shifts and salinity shifts if you live in an area like this. So what kinds of organisms will we run into here? Well, the main producers in mudflats will be seaweeds, because they tend to be tougher, and protists like diatoms. There will be lots and lots of bacteria, and they're going to be important producers too. They're the reason that mudflat areas have that rotten egg, that sulfury smell, because they're busy using processes to break down the protein compounds in the detritus, and it releases a sulfur smell as they do that. In terms of animals, lots of organisms that live in mudflats would be considered infauna, I-N-F-A-U-N-A, infauna. And what that means is those are burrowing animals, animals that will burrow down into the mud and wait for the tides to come back in. So you'll have lots of things like worms and crabs and bivalves, remember two-shelled mollusks, would be very common in mudflat areas. All right, here's a salt marsh. So the salt marsh and the mud flat may be connected, and the salt marsh would be more inland. So these are grassy areas that will extend from the mud flat towards the inland. All right, important producers here are going to be grasses. So for example, here's Spartina, which is a type of cord grass. Now, because you have grasses in the salt marsh area, the roots of those plants will hold the mud in place more. So it's a more stable substrate there. The bottom is more stable. Animals that you're going to run into, shrimp, crabs, mussels, and other bivalves. You'll also run into lots of predators, raccoons, and wading birds like herons and egrets will be common in the salt marsh area. These are more common on the eastern coast of the United States than on the western coast of the United States. Can you remember why that might be? Well, if you remember back when we talked about the geography of the oceans, that the eastern coast has a much gentler coastline. Western coastlines tend to be steeper and drop off. Well, that's not going to be an area that would be conducive to creating a salt marsh. This would have a gentle slope. So we see lots of salt marshes that ring the United States coasts on the east, but many fewer on the west. It's not to say there aren't any, but they're not nearly as common. If we head south into the more tropical areas, the mangrove forest then will replace the salt marshes. So they're like the tropical equivalent of a salt marsh. It is estimated that at one time, of all tropical coastlines in the world, that at least 75% of them were ringed by mangrove forests. Now, that's not the case anymore. In fact, mangrove forests are one of the most endangered ecosystems or habitats on the planet. Why? Well, human destruction for various reasons, either for creation of housing, because people like to live at beaches, or for creating huge nurseries for aquaculture, growing things like shrimp or certain types of fish that are harvested commercially. Mangroves require a lot of fresh water, so they have to live in areas where there's a nice inflow from the rivers. Obviously, the mangroves themselves are the primary producers. What types of consumers, what types of animals would you see? Well, you'll have, again, crabs living along the bottoms here. These are important nurseries for coral reef fish, so the juveniles may live along the mangrove forest because it provides shelter for them when they're juveniles. You'll also find things that we would call epifauna, E-P-I-F-A-U-N-A. And that means that they live attached or on the surface of some substrate. And some of them grow directly on the roots of the mangroves themselves. So things like sponges or oysters, barnacles, lots of snails live there. All right, so why spend time thinking about estuaries? Why are they important to us? Well, I can come up with 6 reasons. First off, they are, as I've mentioned a couple times, important spawning and nursery grounds for a variety of fish. So for example, this adult fish may lay eggs and fertilization occurs at sea, but with tides, the larvae, which then grow into juveniles, are carried into the estuary, where they may live for several years until they grow into their adult form, which will then head back out to sea. They're also important as filtering. Estuaries can filter pollutants like crazy. This is really an interesting experiment here. Same water, no mussels in it, or you put mussels, which would be a common bivalve that you'd find in an estuary, 24 hours later, that's how clear the water is. Now, can they remove all pollutants from water? No, but estuaries are quite important for catching what is sent through waterways. A third reason that estuaries are important is they act as buffers from storms. So they are a protective layer for the mainland. If we do away with them because we want to fill in land and build up developments, then we run the risk at our own hazard when huge hurricanes come along. A fourth reason that they're important is that as various species migrate, might be fish, might be birds, these are rest stops. They're like the rest areas for migrators. What happens if we do away with the estuaries? Where will they go? We will disrupt their patterns. A fifth reason is that estuaries are quite important for commercially harvesting a lot of the food that we like to eat. A lot of these organisms live or at least develop in estuaries. And then lastly, a sixth reason that estuaries are important is they're wonderful resort areas. Humans enjoy being there. Lots of sports are done in estuary areas. There's some boating, skiing, snorkeling. So we should take them seriously and want to protect them. Well, what kinds of things are threatening estuaries anyway? Why should we be worried about their health? We can understand why they're important, what's going on that could threaten them. All right, 7 threats. Number 1, habitat destruction. Like I mentioned, for building homes or resort areas or for aquaculture. So habitat destruction. Number 2, mining. That might be unexpected to you. If you think about it, oil drilling would count as a type of mining, as would trying to find minerals that might be located along the coast. Sand, just getting sand itself. Now, why in the heck would we be mining sand? Because it's an ingredient in concrete. In some areas, gravel mining threatens estuaries. A third reason that estuaries are being threatened is because of construction. For example, dredging out channels for transportation of goods, or damming could be construction projects. We create huge dams to divert waterways, either for generating electricity or for diverting water to water crops that we want to grow in an area where they maybe naturally couldn't grow. So those have huge effects on migration and spawning of organisms, as well as the amount of water flowing into these different estuaries. A fourth reason that estuaries are under threat is because of excess sediments that are washing down with rivers. I mean, obviously, the nutritional value of sediments is important. The bottom material of sediments comes from the flow from the rivers, but too much then causes the water to be so murky and reduces the clarity so much that the phytoplankton production goes down, which then we know has effects on all the food chains. A fifth reason they're under attack, chemical inflow, pollutants, sewage. A sixth reason, over-harvesting of the seafood that grows there. Yes, we want to harvest, but we want to harvest wisely. And so we sometimes harvest too many and don't leave enough of the juveniles to grow back into the adults, or we over-harvest the adults so that there are not enough of them to reproduce to restock the juveniles. And then a seventh reason is called thermal pollution. Now, you might wonder, how can heat be a pollutant? Well, some industry uses water as a coolant to cool its machinery and then pumps the hot water back into the ocean. And you might think, well, what does that matter? It's just water. They're not adding chemicals to the water, right? No, they're not. They're just heating up the water and using it as a coolant and then putting it back in. But as the temperature of water goes up, the oxygen content of water goes down. So if they're pumping hot water back into the bay, then they're reducing the oxygen content for the organisms that live there. So yes, it's an ingenious use of the water, but it can be extremely harmful for the habitats. So industry has to understand the effects that they're having, the long-term effects, in some of their practices. So I hope that you can appreciate what a fine line estuaries walk in terms of their importance to us and the threats that they face, and how important they are as ecosystems for so many of the organisms that we've talked about this year.